on the beast of the end of the world.
About 10 miles away from the shack, there was a wooded area next to the Lake Pontchartrain, and unofficially called the Lake Woods. 3 older guys, holdovers from the hippie movement, were sitting just inside a tree line about 15 yards away from the water, passing around an old whiskey bottle filled with mushroom tea. They were sitting in a circle with 4 flashlights taped together pointing straight up, and a small transistor radio was right next to the light, barely audible. The clouds had disappeared and the crescent moon shined brightly high in the sky and reflected off the waveless water. The 3 men were tripping pretty good by now, just giggling, staring into the yellowish beams from the flashlight. Then the lights began blinking in a circular pattern and changed color as some of them blinked. "Whoa, dudes, did y'all see this shit?" said one of the men. Then they all fell backwards to the ground, laughing hysterically. Then the second man became quiet as he opened his eyes, and the twitching lights were only inches from his face, and then they all heard a loud "boo." The men all fell silent. They wiped their eyes, and there stood a rough-looking teenage boy with the flashlights in his hands. The lights were back to normal. "Hey, dude, that wasn't cool, you bastard. Not cool at all," complained the last guy. "I'm sorry," said the newcomer, "but you have to admit it was a stone gas, man." Then he put the flashlight back on the ground and picked up the whiskey bottle. "Mind if I have a slug?" "Knock yourself out, man." The young man sat down in front of him and took a sip. Then he asked, "Did you gentlemen know that we used to do shrooms over 500,000 years ago?" The men looked at each other, puzzled. One turned to the boy. "I didn't think human beings were around 500,000 years ago." The boy smiled. "No, you weren't, but I was." And then the men looked confused. Then they all grabbed their bellies and started laughing hysterically. After a couple minutes, one of the men rubbed the tears out of his eyes and noticed what looked like blood smeared on his hand. The boy smiled again. "You people just can't handle your dope. Your brains get dulled too easily." Then he picked up the lights again and pointed them at the men's stomachs. They looked down. Blood was flowing slowly like syrup out of 4 slashes in their bellies. They sat there staring, thinking it was illusion brought on by the shrooms. Then the boy lifted the man in the middle up with one hand and brought him out of eye, and then he plunged his hand into his chest and pulled out his heart and showed it to him. The man went limp, and the boy dropped him on the ground. The other 2 men started running into the woods. Then one of them fell to the ground, but before the other could stop and help him, a clawed hand burst through his chest, grasping his heart and sternum. The boy asked him, "I'm wondering, between the mushrooms, the adrenaline, and the shock, did you feel that? I mean, it looks really painful." And his laughter echoed through the woods as he dropped the barely living body to the ground. Then he walked to the last man and kneeled in front of him. The boy looked at both his hands, each one holding a still beating heart. "Well," he chuckled, It appears I'm one hand short. Oh, what to do, what to do. You could let me be, the man on the ground said. I could do that, the boy said as he stood. Then he turned around and took a couple steps. And then he said, but that would be so out of character for me. Then he turned in a flash with his mouth wide open and unnaturally wide and plunged his teeth into the man's chest. Shawnee woke up about 6 a.m. and walked into the kitchen. She figured no one else was awake yet. The sun had just risen above the horizon, and when she heard what sounded like a car door slam in the backyard, she peered out the window and saw 2 step vans pulling away out of the side of the house. She opened the door, but before she could walk outside, a hand grabbed her shoulder, and she let out a shallow scream and turned around. There was Madame Philomene with a stern look on her face. What's going on? Shawnee shrieked. Madame Philomene put her hand on the shaking girl's shoulder. You didn't expect we would leave the poor boy in the shack, did you? But we have to be hugger-mugger about the doings of last night, mon ami. Hugger-mugger? Shawnee asked. Secret, girl, secret. It would not be très bien to have the peoples know about the bad good. She then put her arm around her and sat Shawnee at the kitchen table. What about David's family? She asked. Then a deep voice came from behind her. He'll be considered a runaway, I'm afraid. She turned quickly and saw Codger standing behind her. Let's get breakfast started, madam, and when the others get up, we'll get you up to speed. So Codger pulled out some pans and Philomene set the table while Shawnee sat there in a daze. About a half hour later, the rest of the kids groggily walked into the room. The table was loaded with food. Sid and Willie sat down and gorged themselves. Lisa, Tawny, and Shawnee just kind of nibbled a bit. Codger informed the kids about what was going on, about Tommy, about David, and of the other parties that had been informed. Sid asked, so what about us? First of all, everyone go home and get cleaned up. Then think of something to tell your folks about where you were last night. Except for you, Sid. I already called your folks and told them you were helping me with the project. Then what? Asked Tawny. Codger looked down at her. Then you decide whether or not to come back and join the hunt. Willie chimed in. Hunt for Tommy, you mean? Yes, my boy. It'll be your decision. He'll hide while the sun is out, but come tonight, well, he'll be looking for more victims. Then the old man and woman looked at each other, and Madame Philomene nodded toward the kids. Codger sighed and said, I have to tell you kids something. Tommy will more than likely, then he paused for another few moments, come to call on all of you before the next crescent moon. You mean kill us? Screamed Lisa. Yes, child, said Philomena. The boy doesn't have strong will. He will lead him to you. And we'll end up like David, said Willie. Probably worse, Codger said. Maybe your entire family too. Codger saw the kids were about to panic again, and he grabbed 5 small bottles from the cupboard and handed them to the terrified children. Drink this down quickly. Then they all sucked it down, and in a couple of minutes they felt a little more calm. "You better have a lot of that spunky juice, boo. We're gonna need it big time," said Philomene. The kids looked at each other, and they all said that they would be back tonight, even if they had to sneak out. Sid and Codger drove across the river just outside the town of Gretna. They drove down an old two-lane road which was mostly gravel and came upon a huge and ancient cemetery that must have been 2 miles long. As they passed, Sid could see most of the tombstones were worn and crumbling. Sid's eyes were just fixated on it. Then Codger looked at him. "That is the Amenua necropolis, my boy. One of the oldest and most sinister cemeteries in the New World." "What is Amer... no, Royce?" "It means black souls," Codger told him. "Only the most malevolent of practitioners of the dark arts and their minions are entombed here. As you can see, there have been many over the centuries." Codger then pulled the car to the side and they both got out. "You see those stone statues over every grave? The ones with the winged heads of children? Those are the seraphim. They have been endowed with white magic to keep the black souls in their graves." "Can we go in there?" Sid asked. "I could, my boy. But if you stepped over the threshold, it would rip your soul apart and your spirit energy would cease to exist." "My what?" Sid asked. Codger looked Sid in the eye. "If we succeed in defeating the Grizzly Good, I'll teach you. But until then, you just have to trust me." Then they drove about 2 more miles till they got to a narrow gravel road cutting through the graveyard. Then they came upon a small clearing with a 1-story relic of a building surrounded by an 8-foot wrought iron fence. Codger unlocked the gate and Sid drove the car to the front of the building. The building itself was made of blackened field stones and a roof that was covered in gray slate shingles with a circular chimney made of fire brick. It was about 900 square feet with a thick metal door in the front with what Codger explained was the Helm of Awe, an ancient Norse symbol embossed overhead. And all the windows were circular with a 5-point star inlaid with a troll cross inside to ward off evil. Sid asked Codger how old it was. Codger replied, "It's older than any church in the New World." Codger then pulled a green turquoise key from his coat and said, "Virgia," and slipped the key into the hole. Without turning the key, Codger grabbed Sid's arm and they both took a step back. In a minute, the door slowly creaked open. Sid asked Codger, "What was that word you said?" "Virgia. It means keeper." Codger then reached in his pocket and pulled out an amulet and put it around Sid's neck. "What's this for?" Sid asked. "To keep you from becoming spectral powder, my boy." "Spectral what?" Sid asked inanely. Codger just sighed and shook his head in frustration. He took a deep breath. "This, my boy, is the abode of the banished and the relics of the thy. If anyone were to enter here without hyperphysical protection, they would be slowly devoured by sinister entities imprisoned in there. Now, can we go?" And they took a couple of steps. By the way, let me do the talking. With that, they entered the building.